Grace, 29, sits in the back row at her brother's Harvard graduation, fingers tight around a folded program. Back here again, she murmurs, watching Jack's cap bob in a sea of crimson. Up front, her parents sit in the reserved section. David Clark, founder of Clark Tech, chin high. Helen Clark, pearls perfect, smile sharper than the heels on her shoes. Grace can already hear her father's toast later. To Jack, the future. He inherits the company, the car, the city house. People will clap. Someone will say, "What a legacy." And someone will glance at Grace and ask, "And what does she do?" He breathes out steady. A waiter passes. A man steps aside. A stranger in a neat navy suit touches her aisle seat and says softly, "Miss Clark?" Grace turns. "Yes." He offers an envelope. "A delivery for you. Time sensitive." She blinks. "From who?" He smiles. "From someone who believes you're ready." He slips away before she can ask more. Grace stares at the seal. What now? Her phone buzzes. Jack's text. "You here? Find me after. Please." She types, "Proud of you." Then she slips the envelope into her bag. The band starts. The dean speaks. Grace looks toward the stage and whispers to herself, "If you're watching this, tell me where you're from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated." Then she catches it. She's speaking like she does in her videos, but today she isn't the narrator. Today she's the story. "Okay," she tells herself, half smile, half shield. "Let's finish this chapter." The Clarks live behind white columns in the Hamptons, a house so polished it reflects judgment. "Excellence is a habit," David says at dinner, tapping a fork against a crystal glass. "We aren't lucky. We are prepared." Helen adds, "And presentable. Excellence must look like excellence." Jack grins. Attention fits him like a tailored suit. Grace folds her napkin. He went to community college. He's the Ivy Star. The rules were simple growing up. Numbers belong to Jack, appearances belong to Helen, and silence belongs to Grace. After dessert, David walks Jack through a spreadsheet on his tablet. Here's why Clark Tech scales. Moats. Patents. Margins. He turns to Grace. "And you? How are your projects?" Grace says, "I'm learning, Dad." "Learning what?" he asks, not unkind, just busy. "How to build something that helps people." Helen's eyes sweep Grace's hair. "Darling, a trim would help people." Grace smiles thinly and gathers plates. In the pantry, the housekeeper, Mrs. Miller, soft voice, hard worker, touches Grace's shoulder. "You're a good girl," she says. "Good is not the same as seen," Grace whispers. "Then make them look," Mrs. Miller says. Grace nods, but in this house looking only goes one way. Up the food chain to Jack. She was 8 when she first felt the gap. Grace had spent 2 weeks on a water cycle poster. Cotton ball clouds, blue arrows, careful handwriting. "I want to show you," she told her father, leading him to the dining table. He glanced, checked his watch. "Not bad, Grace. But do you understand the science or just the art?" Before she could answer, 4-year-old Jack toddled in with a battery, wires, and a tiny bulb. "Dad, it lights." David laughed, delighted. "Look at that. Circuits already." He called, "Helen, come see this genius." Grace stood there, hands on the table's edge, the cotton clouds suddenly heavy. "Mine is good too," she said, quiet. Helen kissed Jack's head. "Our little inventor." She looked over her shoulder at Grace's board. "Sweet dear. Next time less glitter." That night, Grace lay awake in her room listening to her parents praise Jack through the wall. "He's going to change the world," David said. Grace whispered into her pillow, "So will I," then swallowed the echo. She took the poster to school the next day and won a small ribbon. At home no one asked. By middle school the pattern was baked in. Teachers wrote on Grace's report cards. "Works hard. Needs to focus. Reads slowly." Her letters danced, numbers flipped. "I'm trying," she'd say. David would answer, "Try smarter." Jack would come home with a robot car or a coding ribbon. "Amazing," David would beam. One 8th grade night, Grace practiced a science fair talk on sound waves. "See these water ripples?" she told her family. "Low sounds make big rings, high sounds make tiny ones. It's cool." David checked his watch. "Projector tomorrow?" "Poster," she said. He nodded, already turning as Jack burst in with a laptop. Dad, I wrote a program to find prime numbers. 2 hours vanished into algorithms. When Grace finished rinsing cups, Helen gave her a once-over. For the fair, do something with your hair. And that shirt, too boxy. Grace bit her lip. Later, Mrs. Miller found her in the hall. Your demo is clever, she said. Different kinds of smart keep the world running. Grace looked up. They only clap for one kind. Then clap for yourself first, Mrs. Miller said. Grace laughed, watery and grateful. Okay. She went to bed repeating the words like a spell. Clap for yourself first. High school didn't soften the edges. It sharpened them. Jack skipped grades and slid into AP everything. Grace studied twice as long for half the score. B+, she'd say. David would clear his throat. In this family we aim higher. Helen would nudge a salad toward her. And we look higher too. Weekends, David took Jack to the office. Watch the dashboard, he'd say. Forecasts churn CAC LTV. Grace learned another language alone, light and shadow. She borrowed a camera from the art room and lost hours in the darkroom watching images bloom. You have an eye, Ms. Brennan told her. Do the show. Grace brought a portfolio home. These got in, she said. Helen smiled. A nice hobby. Don't let it distract from real work. David barely looked up. The real world runs on engineering. Grace tucked the prints back into the folder. On the hallway wall, every family photo told the same story. David tall, Helen polished, Jack centered with something shiny, and Grace a step to the side, smiling so no one would ask her to move farther. At night she scrolled forums about reading troubles and whispered, what if there's a name for this? She didn't know it yet, but there was. And the name would not make her smaller. It would make her free. The crack came on a rainy school night. Grace went back to English class for a jacket she forgot and heard David's voice through the door. She's the weak link, he told the teacher. We tried. She just doesn't have the Clark mind. Grace froze, fingers on the handle. Her English teacher, Mr. Diaz, answered softly, she thinks deeply. She needs a different path, not less effort. David sighed. We'll focus on Jack. Grace stepped back into the hall, heart thudding. At home she said nothing. The next week, the counselor, Ms. Castillo, slid a checklist across the table. These patterns look like dyslexia, she said. Grace blinked. So I'm not lazy? Not even close, Ms. Castillo said. Let's ask your parents for testing. That night Helen waved a hand. We don't do labels in this family. David added, work harder. Grace looked at her shoes. I do. Then do more, he said. After they left, Mr. Diaz tapped the book on her desk. We adapt right here, he said. Audio first, then print. Chunk the page. You'll be okay. Grace whispered, thank you. Small changes made doors crack open. Mr. Diaz read passages aloud. Grace answered out loud before writing. See, he smiled. You know the ideas. Ms. Brennan, the art teacher, put a camera in Grace's hands. Tell stories with light. In the darkroom, Grace watched a face surface on paper and felt something steady in her chest. At dinner, David said to Jack, tell me about AP Calc. Jack explained integrals. David beamed. Helen turned to Grace. How was school? Good, Grace said. I made a photo that looks like rain singing. Helen blinked. That's poetic. David checked his watch. Don't forget SAT prep. Later, Mrs. Miller found Grace on the back steps. You look taller today, she said. I'm not, Grace laughed. Maybe inside, Mrs. Miller said. Keep it. Grace held the air between them like a promise. Sophomore year brought the science fair again. Grace built a water tray and a speaker, showing how low notes made wide rings and high notes made tight lace. Try it, she told classmates. Laughter softened her shoulders. On fair night, David stood for 2 minutes. Nice. Where's Jack? He asked. Jack arrived with a new coding badge. First place, he said. David hugged him. Of course. In the car, Grace stared out the window. Dad, she said steady. I want testing. Silence stretched. Helen clicked her tongue. Grace. I need to know, Grace said. Jack twisted around from the front seat. I'll go with you, he said. Helen sighed. Will we discuss it? At school, Miss Castillo squeezed Grace's hand. Whether they agree or not, your brain is not your enemy, she said. We'll work the system. Grace nodded. Even if I have to build a new one, she murmured. Graduation week arrived like a quiet wave. Grace crossed the stage to polite claps. David missed the first half for a critical meeting. Helen filmed with her phone and typed between names. That night there was no party, just takeout. Community college, Grace said, placing a brochure on the table. Helen's fork paused. Community. He said the word like a stain. David folded his arms. If that's the best you can do, then do it well. Grace looked up. I will. Jack bumped her shoulder. I'm proud of you, he said. Helen forced a smile. We'll cover gas money. Grace swallowed. I've saved some, she said. I'm moving into a small place near campus. David blinked. You can't manage alone. I can, she said. Mrs. Miller hugged her in the doorway. Sometimes you leave to be seen, she whispered. Grace carried the last box to the car and didn't look back. The apartment was the size of a thought. One window, a bed, a wobbly desk. Grace lined up 3 mugs like trophies and breathed. At orientation, a calm professor read her intake notes and said, let's test for learning differences. 2 weeks later, the evaluator smiled kindly. You're bright and dyslexic, she said. This explains everything. Grace laughed and cried at the same time. So my brain isn't broken? It's wired for patterns and pictures, the woman said. We'll give you tools. Text-to-speech, extra time, blue overlays for glare. Grace walked out under a sky that felt wider. She called Miss Castillo. You were right. He texted Jack. I have dyslexia. Okay. He replied in seconds. Proud of you. Tell me everything. That night Grace opened her laptop. Okay, brain, she whispered. Let's work our way, not their way. In a beginner coding class, Dr. Adams noticed the way Grace solved problems. You skip the straight road and take the side path, she said, tapping Grace's pseudocode. You see structure in sound and space. Grace grinned. I think in pictures. That's not a flaw, Dr. Adams said. It's a tool. After class, Grace showed her how some websites made her eyes ache. Lines crowd, she said. Letters tilt. Dr. Adams nodded. Accessibility is design at its best. Want to explore? Grace's yes came out like a breath she'd held since childhood. They started small. A browser tweak to add spacing and adjust fonts on the fly. When the first version worked, Grace clapped once loud. It's real, she said. Dr. Adams smiled. Name it. Grace looked at the code on her screen. Phoenix, she said. Because it helps people rise. Grace lived between the computer lab and the coffee shop, headphones on, code flowing. Test this, she told classmates with tired eyes. Does the page feel calmer? It does, one said surprised. I can read longer. Dr. Adams pushed her gently. Add voice. Add color filters. Let users choose. Grace wrote nights and early mornings, then worked part-time at a photo studio. When Mrs. Miller called, Grace stood in the alley to talk. Are you eating? Mrs. Miller asked. Enough, Grace said, smiling. I'm building something. Helen texted once. Your brother got an internship at Mercer Tech, Grace answered. Tell him congrats. Then she turned her phone face down and added a settings panel titled My Way. People should be allowed to learn on their own terms, she said to the empty room. The empty room agreed. At a campus showcase, a man in a quiet suit lingered at her demo table. Mark Reed, he said, offering a card. I invest in tools that solve real pain. He watched Phoenix change a messy page into something gentle. Who built this? I did, Grace said. With help. Mark asked questions that felt like bridges. What if schools bought this? What if companies did? Grace swallowed. I wanted affordable. He nodded. Good answer. He leaned in. Investors will want your story. Are you ready to be Grace Clark, founder? Grace stared at her name on his card. The Clark part felt heavy. Maybe. I could use a pen name for now, she said. To keep my life quiet while I build. Mark smiled. Protect the work. What name? Grace thought of her grandmother. Sil Parker. Mark tucked the card back into his pocket and said, Oh, Val Parker. Let's talk seed funding. They met in a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and deadlines. Mark drew numbers on a napkin. A small round. Enough to hire 2 developers, not enough to lose your soul. Grace nodded. I keep control. You keep control, he said. He looked at her straight on. One more thing, when you're ready the world needs you, not just the code. Grace tapped the table. I've been the shadow my whole life. Mark folded the napkin. Then step into the light on your terms. She filed an LC, Phoenix Tools LLC founder line reading as, L. Parker. Dr. Adams hugged her. You did this. Grace whispered, we did this. She sent the first offer letters to 2 classmates. Come build with me. At night she practiced a sentence out loud, tasting each word like a new language. I'm the founder. Phoenix grew in careful circles. A school district paid for a pilot. It works, a teacher wrote. Kids who gave up are staying with the text. Grace pinned the email above her desk. Revenue trickled then flowed. She reinvested in features. Mobile, better voices, calmer layouts. She kept these Parker mask on in public. At family dinners, David talked market share with Jack. We'll crush these upstart accessibility apps, he said. Helen patted Grace's hand. How's your little tech support thing? Grace smiled. Growing. Jack texted under the table. Proud of you no matter what Dad says. She sent back a tiny phoenix emoji. Then the Harvard invite arrived for Jack's graduation. White card, gold ink, a note from David. Special announcement. Grace held the card in one hand and Mark's newest email in the other. We're ready for a bigger move. She looked out the window at a sky the color of fresh paper. Okay, she said to herself. Time to write the next page. The Harvard campus shined that morning, banners fluttering, proud families filling the seats. Grace, in a navy dress, sat quietly in the back rows. Helen waved to colleagues in pearls and silk, while David leaned forward to chat with Jack's professors. Grace clutched her bag where the sealed envelope waited. She told herself, this isn't revenge. This is truth. The dean spoke. The graduates marched. Jack's name echoed across the lawn. Helen dabbed her eyes. David rose, clapping so hard his ring hit the rail. Grace clapped too, but her heart was racing. Jack spotted her in the crowd and gave a small nod, a secret smile. For a moment they were just siblings again. She pressed a hand to her chest. I'm proud of you, she whispered, though her story was about to eclipse his. That night, chandeliers glittered in the Cambridge restaurant David had rented for Jack's graduation dinner. Waiters poured champagne. Guests murmured about legacy and genius. Grace sat at a far corner table half hidden by a pillar. She sipped water, invisible as always. Then David tapped his glass. Friends, he boomed, tonight we honor Jack. He is not only my son but the future of Clark Tech. Applause rang out. To support his rise, I gift him 25% of the company, a Tesla, and our Manhattan home. Guests gasped and clapped harder. Helen's eyes shone with pride. Grace's cheeks burned. She braced herself for the usual afterthought. And Grace, we wish you comfort. But before David could sit, the door opened. Mark Reed stepped in, his tailored suit cutting the room into silence. Whispers rippled. That's Reed Investments. The venture capitalist. David smiled eagerly. Mr. Reed, what an honor. Come join us. But Mark only nodded politely and walked past him, straight to Grace's table. Chairs scraped as heads turned. Grace, Mark said warmly, placing a hand on her shoulder, the time has come. He pulled out an envelope and set it before her. The truth belongs to you now. Gasp spread. David frowned. Grace, what is this nonsense? Helen's hand froze around her glass. Grace stood, legs trembling but voice steady. Actually, Dad, this is exactly the right time. She walked to the main table, the envelope in her hands. Do you know Phoenix Tools? She asked. David snorted. A nuisance competitor. Accessibility toys. Not serious business. Everything, Grace said, laying down the documents. I am Phoenix Tools. I am Phil Parker. Silence fell so sharp it rang. Helen's fork clattered. Jack blinked. Then slowly he smiled. You. David barked. Impossible. You barely passed math. Grace's chin lifted. Because of undiagnosed dyslexia. The same one you denied when I begged for testing. I built Phoenix to help people like me. 3 million users worldwide. 200 schools. 1,000 companies. Yesterday we were valued at $210 million. The crowd murmured louder. David's face paled. Helen found her voice first. This is absurd. You running a tech firm? Grace turned to her mother, voice calm. Yes. Because intelligence is not one shape, one measure, one sun. It is resilience. It is vision. It is rising when no one believes in you. David's jaw worked. Why hide behind a fake name? Because you wouldn't have believed me, Grace said. Because you told me my place before I even had one. So I built it myself. A businessman guest whispered, Clark Tech has been losing contracts to Phoenix. David flinched. Mark slid the last page forward. And now, Phoenix offers to acquire Clark Tech for $60 million. The room gasped. David stared, caught between anger and awe. Jack stood suddenly. I knew, he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. I knew she was Phoenix. He told me last year. And I kept her secret. Helen gasped. You knew. Jack nodded, smiling at his sister. I always knew Grace was brilliant. Just not in the ways you valued. He hugged her fiercely. You did this without anyone's help. You should be proud. Tears burned Grace's eyes. Applause broke out from a few guests. For the first time in her life, people weren't looking through her. They were looking at her. Seeing her. David sank back into his chair, face ashen. He muttered, Why reveal this now? Why ruin Jack's night? Grace shook her head. I'm not here to ruin anything. Jack deserves his celebration. I came because I will no longer let you define me as the disappointment. Tonight I tell my truth. He turned to the room. For 29 years I was the invisible child. Tonight I am not invisible. Jack squeezed her hand. And tonight, he said smiling, I am proud to be your brother. The guests clapped again, this time louder, more genuine. Grace exhaled, shoulders lighter than they had ever been. The next morning, David walked into Phoenix headquarters. The glass walls, adaptive lighting and open design startled him. You built this, he asked. Grace nodded. For people like me. For people you called weak. They discussed the acquisition terms line by line. David argued, negotiated, but finally leaned back, weary. It's fair, he admitted. Then softer, why didn't you tell us sooner? Grace met his eyes. Would you have listened? Silence was his only answer. This isn't about revenge, she added. It's about helping millions who struggle like I did. He looked at her differently then, not as the disappointment but as a force. In the weeks that followed, the deal closed. Phoenix acquired Clark Tech. David accepted a board seat. Helen threw herself into charity work for children with learning challenges, her public apology thinly veiled but real enough. Jack, free from the burden of heir to Clark Tech, applied to medical research programs. At the launch of the new Phoenix Foundation, Grace stood at a podium. We will find children like me sooner, she told the crowd. We will give them tools, not shame. Cameras flashed. Emails poured in. And for once the name Grace Clark wasn't whispered with pity. It was spoken with respect. Months later at a quiet family dinner, David raised a glass. To Grace, he said, voice rough with humility, who taught us there are many ways to be extraordinary. Helen added softly, and to forgiveness. Jack lifted his glass too. And to the Phoenix, who rises. Grace smiled, the toast wrapping around her like warmth. She had once been the shadow. Now she was the flame. The girl who was dismissed, belittled, underestimated. She had built something powerful from the ashes. And she finally understood. Her story had never been about revenge. It had always been about rising into her true self. Moral lesson. True success is not measured by wealth or approval, but by the courage to embrace who you are and turn your struggles into strength. Even when others dismiss you, your differences can become your greatest power. Where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment and subscribe to this channel for more.